As the member of the Labor Party that is here before you this evening, and in the absence of my other candidate, Ross Baster, I realise that I've got the lowest score, and I guess in some ways will be the person who has the most to defend or to seek your support in terms of our position on climate change. First of all, can I say though, what is really important about this particular election is that climate change is up there in terms of the top 3 or 5 issues that people are considering when they are considering how they're going to vote on November 24th. And whilst many people will say that's because we are currently in a crisis, people are concerned about water shortages, they are hearing the message of climate change. I think it is also testament to the number of very dedicated and committed environmental activists that have been out there for the last 20, 30, 40, even 50 years, arguing strongly that we need to do better about looking after our planet. And as much as we will always react in terms of a community when there's a crisis, I think we also have to acknowledge that issue is there because many people have been arguing for a very long time. Before I get into answering the 5 particular questions, I would like to say though that the Labor Party does have a commitment to reducing the impacts of climate change, and we do actually have a plan, and there are a number of aspects to that plan which unfortunately we can't go into a lot of detail this evening, and I'd like to focus on the 5 that have been picked out. But in beginning my answers, I would like to just point out the 10 key points, I guess, that are part of the Labor Party's framework for climate change, which is restoring Australia's international leadership on climate change, and that means unequivocally signing the Kyoto Protocol. We are absolutely committed to that. And we're committed to it, obviously, not just because we believe that is the right way to exercise political leadership within this country and indeed internationally, but the targets that are there, the commitment that are being made by a vast number of countries across the world are clearly ones that if we work together we can achieve. It's interesting to note that the current government does claim that they don't need to sign it because they in fact have basically reached the targets anyway. I'd just like to put a little plug in here for my own party. It is in fact probably because of the initiatives of many state Labor governments, particularly around tree clearing, that we have reached those targets. So it's not even out of their actions that they can even lay that claim. We want to develop a carbon market and reform our institutions, lead by example through good purchasing practices, and in government we've made some commitments around energy use within Parliament, within the parliamentary buildings, and also looking at ways in which we can actually get a much greener fleet in terms of government vehicles. Driving a clean energy revolution through a strong mandatory renewable energy target and investment in clean energy research and development, as that's one of the questions. I'll get to that a little later. Helping Australian families to green their homes through both investments in terms of encouraging people to change their behaviour, but also support through various rebates on solar energy, on clean energy, and obviously also a number of rebates in supporting water, reducing water conservation initiatives, rainwater tanks, grey water usage, those sorts of very fundamental things to a household, but obviously, if taken up in the sorts of percentages that we'd like to see across the country, can make a real difference in energy and water consumption. Investing in cleaner businesses and creating new jobs, working in partnership with businesses to drive energy efficiency improvements, investing in sustainable agriculture and protecting our biodiversity, investing in cleaner transport, including the establishment of a $500 million green car partnership to drive the use of greener, more efficient cars, preparing Australia for the future impacts of climate change, and securing our future water supplies, and ensuring that 30% of wastewater is recycled nationally by 2015. So that's the 10-point framework that we've put out to the electors of Australia to assess our position on climate change. In terms of the questions that we asked, the first one was, do you support legislation that guarantees greenhouse gas emissions? Much has been mentioned tonight. Our target is not 80% by 2050, but it is in fact 60%, as you saw, in line with the European Union and other major Western countries. We obviously believe that this is an international issue. We need to work in partnership with other major greenhouse gas polluting countries, and we need to work together to reduce it across the globe. In terms of the target of 30% below 1990 levels by 2020, I notice I've got a cross on that, but can I just clarify, we actually haven't announced our target as yet, because Kevin Rudd has commissioned Professor Ross Garnaut to actually produce a report by June next year, 2008, which will look at both the cost of doing nothing and the cost effectiveness of dealing with climate change, and in fact the cost benefits that will come if we invest in renewable energy, in reaching targets and reducing our emissions. So we actually haven't said we won't have a 2020 target. What we've actually said is that we will be guided by that report, both on the greenhouse gas emissions target by 2020, but also in terms of the second question, which is legislating on renewable energy targets. We will be guided on that report. We will also be releasing much stronger policy statements about mandatory renewable energy targets during the course of the election. And I should have said at the beginning, my comments tonight are obviously based on policies that we have already released. And obviously the scorecard is based on that as well. Can I assure you though that over the next 5 weeks there will be more policy announcements around this particular issue, and I am sure that in all those cases people will be responsive, and we will certainly be addressing this issue in a much more positive way than the current government. So in terms of that part of question 1, we will determine some targets once we get the Garnaut report. In terms of question 2, we are looking at some very clear policy statements prior to the election, but obviously have not been released until now. Will I oppose the introduction of nuclear energy generation? Absolutely, unequivocally, without question. There is no way that the Australian Labor Party will endorse nuclear power as an energy source in this country. Not only because we don't see it as an environmentally friendly source of energy, because no one ever talks about the impact of nuclear waste, and nobody ever talks about the health risks and the risks, in fact, to local communities by having a nuclear power station nearby. But also it is just unrealistic to think that by the time you would get the number of nuclear power stations running in this country, the Great Barrier Reef and many more things would already be gone, Chris, by the time that ever came into fruition. So not only is it once again a very clever diversion by the Prime Minister, not only once again is it a backward-looking 1950s solution to a problem that was created then, it is also unrealistic in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And lastly, unfortunately, I don't have the time, but I wanted to talk in quite detail about the emphasis we want to put on overseas assistance in terms of the Pacific solution, working much more closely with our Southeast Asian neighbours in terms of reducing tree clearing, in terms of supporting renewable energy, and obviously quite clearly trying to work with the South Pacific nations to reduce climate change impacts, because they will be the wave of refugees that we will see coming into this country if we don't actually deal with those issues. And finally, in terms of coal-fired power stations, our policy is to look at researching clean coal technologies. I know that there is a lot of debate and discussion about that, but we obviously have a large number of people in this country employed as coal miners. It is a big industry, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to see it go, but we do want to make sure that there are technologies that can see it cleaned up if possible. Thank you.
Authorised by James Whelan, The Big Switch, Brisbane.